Welcome, everybody. My name is Shane Keats, and I'm the Director of Marketing here at DataXu. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar called Fighting Fraud, How to Protect Your Marketing Investment. It's featuring Aaron Keckley of DataXu and Susan Bedell of Fraudster Research. If there's one thing I want you to take away from today's webinar, it's that there's cause for optimism. As you'll hear from Aaron and Susan, fraud is a tough and growing problem, but there is a path forward. Our goal in the next 45 minutes or so is to give you the knowledge and confidence you need to take that journey. We'll have plenty of time for questions, but before we get started, a couple of quick housekeeping items. You'll be in listen-only mode to cut down on background noise. The webinar control panel can be opened and closed by clicking on the red arrow button in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can send them by opening that control panel and typing them in the question box. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll send you an email with a link to the recording early next week. And with that, some brief introductions for our speakers. Aaron Keckley is the product innovator here at DataXu who brings our vision of data-enabled marketing to fruition, creating a platform that empowers even the least quantitative employees and marketers to use advanced analytics capabilities to increase their marketing ROI. Prior to DataXu, he held leadership roles at RSA, the security division of EMC, and several venture-backed startups, including ChoiceStream and Hello Wallet. Susan Bedell comes to Fraudster Research with more than 20 years of experience in the publishing industry at brands such as People, Fortune, Money, and Time Digital, among others. Immediately prior to joining Fraudster, Susan was the Senior Director of Sales Development for PubMatic, a supply-side platform servicing the needs of publishers in the digital realm. Her most recent publication is Ad Fraud's Dirty Little Secret and How the Fraudsters Make Money in the Process, which she published just this past November. Our agenda for today. Aaron's going to kick it off by looking at how we got here, kind of why we're even hosting a webinar like this. He and Susan will then help level set us so we can have a kind of common understanding of the problem. Susan will take us through some of her research and recommendations, and then Aaron will take us home with a pretty cool case study around how DataXu took on the fraudsters. Expect some rare honesty. And now, without further ado, I'll turn the session over to Aaron.
Great, thanks Shane, and Susan, thanks for joining us. It's really a pleasure to have you with us today. So by now, we've all seen the dramatic headlines about ad fraud. Each one cites a larger and larger astronomical number of dollars that advertisers have lost to fraud. It really is enough to freak you out if you let it. You know, the media loves a good story, and this one kind of has it all. It's got crime and scandal and suspense and drama and tons of money at stake. And it's actually true, so it gets to be news. For me, it's kind of ironic because in a previous stage of my career, I ran the product group at RSA Security, and there I focused on online banking fraud. At that time, it was phishing attacks that were taking over the headlines. These attacks were designed to lure one into giving up your password, and they were rampant and really jeopardizing the online banking channel that had become so important to the banking industry. And while we didn't completely eliminate fraud there, we got it, the problem largely under control. So I obviously left, and here I am today presenting to you, and left the banking security business for the greener pastures of digital marketing. And it turns out that the fraudsters also did, and so here we all are today, fraudsters and all. So the industry responds. So last year at the IAB Leadership Conference, and I would say somewhat surprisingly, the industry association made fraud its #1 agenda item. I happened to be at that meeting, and I can tell you that it was not the thing that people expected to be the front and center issue. The industry launched several new organized efforts to combat ad fraud, including the Trustworthy Accountability Group, or TAG. About 8 months later, the ANA published a very detailed, I think very strong piece focusing on the extent of bot-generated ad fraud. And so in 2014, with a lot of activity, it seemed like there was finally going to be some real change in the industry. So as 2015 opened, though, it turned out to be sort of a case of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Once it really started to sober up to what was happening, the industry, I think, and people in the industry started to realize this was going to be a really much harder problem than they thought. It was not obvious how to go about solving the fraud problem, even if you can measure it. And, we all know that there are perverse incentives up and down the value chain from the advertiser to the publisher, where agents and stewards of the media dollar actually gain indirectly from the existence of fraud in the form of artificially boosted KPIs and fees. And I'm not suggesting that these people are fraudsters, but just that it's kind of people don't necessarily have the incentive to reduce the fraud as much as you might hope. And this is right about the time that the excuses come out, and sometimes it's the too busy excuse, we're too busy, or sometimes it's a not my problem excuse, or sometimes it's just laziness. And I think a lot of people were concluding, maybe it would just be easier to put your head back in the sand and don't be too far out in front of this one. Just try to not be dead last in this in dealing with this problem. But the problem didn't go away. It's gotten worse, and it's gotten more public. As you can see from these headlines, it's gotten more infuriating and more embarrassing to the brands whose money is actually being stolen. So our viewpoint is acknowledgement is the first step, and here's where kind of the DataXu story starts. We began our own process of how to deal with the fraud problem by first measuring comprehensively across all the advertisers and campaigns and inventory sources running through our platform. And it turned out that we, like everyone else, had a fraud problem. The benchmark rates for the industry for direct buys, around 2 to 7% for ad networks, 4 to 20%, and exchange media, a bit higher, 6 to 30%. Our fraud rates were around 20 to 25%, which was in line with what the industry rates were for overall exchange-traded media. So first, a level set on some definitions. What is fraud? So fraud is, the biggest thing about fraud is it's deception, it's misrepresentation, it's criminal. And our definition here that we use is an ad impression that either has no chance of being seen by a human or is being misrepresented by the seller to increase its value. So it could be human, but it's being misrepresented. This is in contrast to the concept of viewable and brand safety. Viewability is, an ad impression that's visible to a human on a web browser for a certain amount of time. It's based on an objective standard, so it's the same for everybody, but it's not fraud. Brand safe, kind of taking it a step further, is actually a normative concept that really varies from brand to brand. So there aren't really hard standards around brand safety. There's kind of, a problem when you see it, norms at work when it comes to brand safety. Digging deeper into fraud, there are several types of fraud. The two main classifications that we focus on are bot fraud and site fraud. Bot fraud is non-human traffic. It's impressions, clicks, can be some types of conversion actions that are generated by bots and botnets. And these botnets are built up by fraudsters using malware that gets distributed to machines all over the planet, really. And it becomes a botnet that they can activate and perpetrate ad fraud. Site fraud is a little bit different. It's manipulating the site itself in deceptive ways, where it may be human traffic or partially human traffic, but it's a site itself that's committing the fraud, the site operator. So digging even deeper, what this slide really shows is, this is not intended for you to learn and memorize all the types of fraud that are there, but more just to convey to you that there are many, many forms of fraud, like ad injection and multi-burns of non-human traffic and retargeting fraud and conversion fraud and more. And really the one thing that we can count on here is that this list is going to grow and it's going to evolve. The fact is that the fraudsters stand to gain a lot from their endeavors. Fraud is an economic crime. Fraudsters are rational. They are investing. They are hiring the most talented technologists that they can, and they're paying them to come up with new and more effective ways to perpetrate fraud. They're going to spend their resources according to where they get the highest ROI. And another way of looking at that is where can they get the highest return for the least amount of work and cost. So fraudsters will continue to invest more and more in more and more sophisticated and complex tactics, essentially until it becomes uneconomic for them as a business proposition. At the same time, anyone trying to prevent fraud should really be thinking about this as an expense to be managed. It doesn't make sense to spend more on fraud prevention than you have in fraud losses, right? And this is how the financial industry, which is much more mature at dealing with fraud, this is how it's thought of in the financial industry. It's something that you manage. You don't try to defeat it or purely solve it. It's something that you have to wisely and continuously monitor and manage. So at this point, I'd like to turn things over to Susan. Susan's going to share some highlights from her research on fraud and some great actionable advice for marketers.
So Aaron gave you a definition of fraud. From Forrester's point of view, before we get started, I'm going to give you our definition of fraud, which is fraud in digital advertising is characterized by reaping financial rewards through the deployment of technologies that mislead advertisers on where their ads are running and or who or what is clicking and interacting with those ads. We, as Aaron did too, try to distinguish between viewability issues, which are complex, and but I believe the industry is grappling with them, as opposed to fraud, which is where there is out-and-out malicious intent. Next slide, please. So we're going to look at the amount of money that's lost in display alone. Now, the estimates are that as much as 40% of all impressions are fraudulent impressions. I personally believe that's a high number. I believe that the number that Aaron gave earlier, which was in the 25% range, is far more reasonable about the level of fraud. And I think 40% comes from the fact that a lot of measurement companies also measure viewability, and it's in their best interest sort of to conflate the two numbers and make an already very bad situation look even worse. Next click, please. That represented $11.6 billion in 2014. That's 11.6 billion advertiser or marketer dollars that were lost to fraud. Next click. And that was a 22% increase over the amount in 2013. And next click, please. Driven largely in display by botnets, ad stacking, and impression laundering. So those numbers reflect dollars lost to marketers. There are nefarious publishers out there, but the vast majority of publishers are honorable publishers, and they too are suffering because the CPMs. First of all, the entire ecosystem is tainted. To a degree, there are marketers who are hesitant to invest in due to the fear of being taken to the cleaners, really. And then CPMs that publishers are able to charge are impacted by this general fear and lack of enthusiasm. So let's go to the next slide, please. Video is we talk about display, and those numbers were specific to display, but I do want to point out that video, because it has very high CPMs, is a favorite target. Coca-Cola, Ford Motor Company, McDonald's, and others were caught up and lost millions to the tune of many millions per month for over 6 months by one fraudster alone, based in Florida. And when the authorities got there, they found an empty office and no trace of the the bad guys. Next slide. Now, the IAB believes that the reason for video being a target is that the quality of supply isn't great, and the reason for that is that it's more expensive to create, so CPMs are higher against a limited supply, making video a better target, meaning that fraudsters can make a quick buck faster in video than in display and even than in mobile as well. Next slide. Mobile is, however, not an exception. It is difficult to measure mobile fraud levels for a variety of reasons. First, you have two different environments, web and app. You have multiple operating systems, and you have fat finger syndrome, which really complicates getting a good picture on it. For what it's worth, what can be done in display can be done in mobile web, with rare exceptions. Next slide, please. A post-click analysis offers a window on mobile fraud. So this is a company called PureClick. This information comes from PureClick. They measure what happens after the click. And so they have determined that in mobile, for example, only 8% of people actually confirmed that they intended to leave the site they were on and go to the advertiser's site. 19% post-click simply disappeared. There was no action taken whatsoever. And the IAB believes that the Media Ratings Council, the senior vice president there, David Gunzerath, told me recently that the 19% is likely fraud. Next slide, please. So these are some of the strategies for committing fraud. Aaron referred to botnets. And it's important to note that the consumer almost never knows that this is actually happening. The experience of the consumer is, generally speaking, seamless. So they're completely not aware, for instance, with botnets, that their computer has been, the control over their computer has been seized by a botnet. And that botnet is controlling what gets measured by the measurement companies about what ads are being served. Next slide, please. Stacked ads. Now, this is an example of an unethical publisher. To the consumer will see one ad, that blue ad space there. It's the only ad that's visible to the consumer. But stacked up behind those are all sorts of ads, and I've listed here, I think I have 7 fake ad impressions. It can be more than 7. It can be, 15 or more. The sky's the limit, really. They all get measured as having been served, but they're charged for, but there is never an opportunity for a consumer to actually see them. So that's an example of fraud being committed by an unethical publisher. And then there's impression laundering. Fake and rogue sites assume the characteristics of legitimate sites through a complex series of redirects. In my research, I will say that ESPN is a favorite target of this, probably because it's so incredibly popular. But there are a lot of unethical people out there pretending to be ESPN, putting inventory up for sale on a variety of exchanges and representing that inventory as ESPN inventory, and it is not ESPN inventory. Next slide. And they're certainly not alone in being victims of that. So here are strategies in mobile: bad traffic, spoofing, phantom apps, data center virtualization, redirects, and location misrepresentation. So let's take them one at a time. Bad traffic. Every publisher comes, well, pretty much every publisher comes to the end of the day, the week, the month, the quarter, and they're missing out on, they can't meet their campaign guarantees and with their own organic traffic, so they go and they buy traffic. And most responsible publishers will buy their traffic from ethical or what they believe are ethical sources. However, they don't follow the sources all the way through. So I'm the publisher and I buy from ABC source of traffic, and I don't ask ABC what their source of traffic is. I don't follow what's referred to as the daisy chain all the way through to their last and ultimate source of traffic, XYZ. So although I believe I'm acting in good faith and I believe that ABC supplier of traffic to me is acting in good faith, I cannot be certain that that is true all the way through to the very last source. I can assure you that even publishers in the ComScore top 50 have been guilty of this and have therefore introduced bad traffic into their systems. Spoofing is where fraudulent simulations of established publishers, that's as I was mentioned before when I showed you those redirects above, that's where you pretend to be ESPN, but you are not ESPN. And if you are listing your non-ESPN inventory with an exchange that doesn't filter adequately, the buyer is going to be buying on ESPN, but they're not really. Phantom apps is where fraudsters get access to a publisher's SDKs and actually publish an app that a consumer will go to download, and because they are compensated based on the clicks that lead to download, and when the consumer gets there, there is no app. Data center virtualization is where someone sitting in Kazakhstan on their desktop computer can make it appear that they are actually on a mobile device. So this is, as I said, strategy in mobile. Redirects are where a consumer, now this does affect the consumer experience, where they will be on a site and they will be swiftly taken to another site, and that happens multiple times, and it certainly impacts the consumer's experience. It's extremely frustrating to the consumer. It's much more prevalent in mobile than it is on desktop. Location misrepresentation. So a lot of mobile inventory is sold on the basis that the consumer can be identified as being in front of a Starbucks on the corner of 34th Street and 5th Avenue, when in fact they are somewhere in that zip code, but the fraudster can make it look as though they're actually right in front of the Starbucks, and the inventory was sold based on delivering the consumer in front of the Starbucks. Next slide. So in 2013, late 2013, Fraudster participated with the Association of National Advertisers in a survey of their members. They have about somewhere in the neighborhood of 650 members, and they represent really the highest, the largest of marketers in the United States. The survey was asking them what was their greatest concern, and at the time, about a year ago, when we got the results of the survey, transparency or the lack thereof was their greatest concern, specifically transparency in programmatic buying. Fraud was not yet a major concern. Transparency had been a concern the year before and was growing as a concern. Next slide, please. Fraud, however, was on the radar. Among the respondents, on a scale of 1 to 10, so 1 is not concerned at all and 10, their hair's on fire, you can see that click fraud and bots were growing rapidly in the two most urgent segments of responses, and they are considerably, they're of great concern. So fraud at the time was not the #1 focus, which goes back to what Aaron was saying, made it a surprise when it was the focus of the variety of conferences he was referring to. but it is certainly now a major, major focus. Next slide, please. So what are the marketer responsibilities in eliminating, or to Aaron's point, we probably never will eliminate fraud. I think I always say that bad guys or fraudsters with algorithms will always be a step ahead of good guys with algorithms. But there are things that both marketers and publishers can do to keep fraud at a reasonable level. Marketers should stop looking for bottom dollar deals. In general, I believe that you get what you pay for, and if you're looking for a bottom dollar deal, that's what you're going to get. You should also consider other measures of success beyond the click. And the reason that I think this is extremely important is that it's very easy for bots to click. And in fact, bots now can fill out forms. So there have been marketers in the past that said, well, I don't really care about it because I filter out fraud past the click because I have a form to fill out. Well, there are bots that can fill out forms. So those marketers are no longer filtering out bots. And I believe that you should embrace transparency, and that is kind of goes back to the concern that marketers expressed in the survey with the ANA. If you as a marketer require that you have a comprehensive list of where your ads ran, you are more likely to be assured, and you work with ethical and responsible partners, you are more likely to be assured that you will keep fraud at a minimum. Next slide. So this is where I say choose your partners wisely. Andrew Casali is the Vice President of Strategy at Casali Media, which is an exchange. He says that exchanges can filter toolbars. They also have an incentive to grow scale, audience scale, right? So the more inventory they have, the more buyers they have, the more business they have. So they may not be incentivized to actually examine the inventory they're offering to be sure that it's legitimate inventory. Work with exchanges that do that. Next slide, please. From a publisher perspective, don't stack ads. It's unethical. Just don't be unethical. And stop compromising quality traffic to fulfill campaign requirements. If you must buy traffic, follow the daisy chain through to the end and make sure, it's in your own best interest to do so, make sure that everyone is above board, legitimate, and honorable. Qasim Safi, who works at OpenX, said publishers are over-reliant on paid traffic, and I believe that that's the case. And so I tell every publisher I speak to stop. Next slide, please. And marketer and publisher responsibilities both should consider the company they keep. So publishers should only work with exchanges that exercise the greatest filtering, and marketers should only buy through exchanges that exercise the greatest filtering. What's good about this slide is that it shows you a brand new report that's offered by Pixelate. They started in January. They examined the inventory offered across the top exchanges. I just show you the first page of their report. For who has and they score them for fraud. And it will probably come as no surprise when you look and see who has scored well and who hasn't. And you see the nuances in the scores, right? So the difference between the first one and the 10th one are quite minimal. But the differences between the first one and the 50th one are significant. This is a report. It's available once a month. It's worthwhile checking out. Next slide, please. Marketers and publishers alike, you should embrace programmatic to fight ad fraud. Now, I know marketers are embracing programmatic. There are publishers who are resisting. And a lot of people conflate programmatic with fraud itself. Fraud has, as with all other markets, as with financial market, as Aaron was talking about at the very beginning of the presentation, fraud exists. It always will, wherever, in whatever market you're talking about. What programmatic offers is an ability to see at the impression level what's really going on. So for the first time, the digital advertising ecosystem has a way to identify fraud and therefore combat it. Publishers, I always advise publishers to buy their own site. So one of the things that we didn't talk earlier was, well, we talked about bad guys pretending to be ESPN or pretending to be, you know, Bleacher Report or whatever. If the publishers, the legitimate publishers, go out and buy their own site, work with a DSP, buy your own site on a regular basis, you will see where your inventory is available, and you will know, you do know where your inventory should be available. A perfect example is that YouTube should only be available through Google, but it is not. It is available in other places. Be very suspicious if you are buying YouTube and you're not buying it through Google. And marketers, be wary of deals that look too good. As with most things, you get what you pay for. If you're being offered inventory at a price that is too low and you know it's too low, you should be very, very suspicious. And now I believe that I'm handing it back. Thank you very much for having me. I'm going to hand the controls, or actually I'm going to hand the mic back over to Aaron, because DataXu has a very interesting approach to how to manage and deal with fraud, keep it at bay. Aaron?
Yeah, thanks, Susan. That was really great. So getting back to our story here at DataXu, as I mentioned earlier, we started our process by first conducting comprehensive measurement across our platform. And to do this, we worked with several technology partners who were experts in ad fraud. You know, we sent out an RFP and went through the whole evaluation process, tested a bunch. And it turned out, as part of that initial measurement stage, that we were really no better or no worse than the industry at large. So in a way, it was kind of a relief, oddly. But you know, definitely there was a problem. So the one thing we didn't necessarily expect right out of the gate was that fraud occurred in hotspots. So in other words, it wasn't an even spreading of fraud across everything. Some advertisers and some campaign types and some exchanges in particular were particularly hard hit. But pretty much across the board, even where it wasn't the worst, it was still enough that we were concerned. We also realized that this had been resulting in a lot of operational problems. Both our customers and DataXu were feeling the pain of fraud in the ways of discrepancies and weird campaign behavior and unsavory placements. So aside from the hard cost of the actual fraud itself, there were hidden costs in the form of countless hours of investigation and remediation type activities. We recognized that also that the problem was really only going to get worse as digital and programmatic grew. And that we really couldn't wait for everyone else to solve it. You know, DataXu is at the last point in the chain before the advertiser. So, you know, more than anyone, we would be in a position to say, hey, it's upstream from us. Please clean it up. It's not our problem. But it wasn't really the right thing for our customers. So we decided we probably needed to be more proactive than the industry. So here's a little more data. The rates vary. You know, the fraud exists in every vertical, but, you know, ranging in our case from a high of 22.8% to a low of 8.2%. But even 8.2% fraud is really still pretty high. And so, again, we believe that every advertiser needs to consider how they're addressing this problem. The next interesting thing we found is that fraud rates are significant across price points. So although there was higher fraud rates in lower cost media, fraud existed at a material level really at all price points. So from our viewpoint, increasing the price you're willing to pay for media is actually not a great solution. You can see that it's actually lowest or lower at some of the lowest price points. So 25 cents to 50 cents, you have some of the lowest fraud rates. Well, that's kind of counterintuitive. So, you know, when we were thinking about this, I was reminded of this famous quote by Slick Willie Sutton, the bank robber, which a lot of you probably heard. He was asked why he robs banks, and he said, well, because that's where the money is. And so one interpretation here is that fraudsters are just simply attacking where the volume is highest. And as it turns out, you know, the $1 to $2 price range on display media is pretty much the most popular price range on exchanges. And so you could conclude that if everyone just started spending on higher price media, the fraudsters would just simply follow them. So there's nothing inherent to the media price, in other words. Based on data like this and more, we concluded you couldn't just like cross the street to avoid fraud and unsavory placements. It was harder than that. We also realized that if we could get the right fraud protection in place, on the upside, you could take advantage of media at all price points. So you could still have a successful and largely fraud-free campaign with an average CPM of say, $2. You just need to be able to avoid buying the fraudulent impressions. So it was around this time in our investigation that our fraud team at DataXu briefed the leadership team. And we all, you know, to be honest, had this moment of panic and doubt. And we had tons and tons of questions about what would happen if we substantially eliminated fraud from our platform. You know, and it was things that a lot of us, you know, probably a lot of people listening have wondered about. What if we can no longer scale? What if performance tanks? We knew a lot of performance metrics were potentially inflated by fraud and fraud actions, either because of the particular metric or bots filling out forms or what have you. What would it do to our revenue? If we were clean, but everyone else was still turning a blind eye to the inflated metrics, would we lose our perceived competitiveness? What will it cost us to fight fraud? How much will we have to spend, both in terms of partner technology and internal costs? What if we can't keep up with the fraudsters? And are our customers and partners really ready to face the truth about what's happening? Ultimately, for DataXu, I think that the most important thing we did as a company was to commit ourselves to truly addressing the challenge. And honestly, this required a pretty big leap of faith. Once we made that leap, though, things really started to fall in line. So what does commitment look like? First of all, we built a team, and this was a cross-functional team that included product management, services, operations, engineering, business development, and our data science team. And we chartered that team, which we nicknamed the Fraud Squad. We chartered them to define and execute our strategy, and this is some of the members of that team. And you know, so you got to have some levity when you you know, keep it light when you're working on fighting fraud. It helps everybody. So we built the Fraud Squad. That was kind of the first big step that we made. We refined our homegrown fraud fighting tools, such as detecting anomalous behavior, filtering, you know, high velocity IP addresses, avoiding super clicking cookies, performing malware scanning. But we knew that, you know, fraudsters would really be willing to invest a lot, and we knew that on our own we would struggle to keep up. So we sought out a best-in-class partner to supplement our own fraud protection. We invested heavily in R&D to create platform-wide programmatic and fully automated measurement and countermeasures. And we invested heavily in people and process to manage the fraud levels on an ongoing basis. So again, it isn't a problem you just solve and then move on to the next thing. You have to stay with it and manage it. And then finally, we aim for outcomes. So you can see here that we were able to get our platform-wide fraud rate down into the 2 to 3% range. And you know, we really wanted to take this issue off the table for our customers and not force them to have to think and worry about, the nuances of fraud types and the counter fraud solutions and which fraud solution will combat which type of fraud and so on and so forth. And this is important because they're marketers, and we wanted them to be able to focus on marketing, not on fraud. So how do we do this? Defense in depth was sort of a key principle that we adopted early on. Defense in depth is a layering tactic, actually originated by the NSA, now considered to be a best practice in IT security. And the idea is basically to use several independent methods to defend a system against attack. So we adapted the idea to fight ad fraud on behalf of our advertisers, and we've implemented 5 independent layers. The first one is bot filtering. Bot filtering removes suspicious users that may generate conversion actions from our machine learning classifiers. This means that if a bot is causing a spike in actions or clicks from a given domain or publisher, they will be filtered from the algorithm, and the system will not learn or optimize towards them. Because bot filtering is at a user level, you can also protect against bots even on premium publisher sites without sacrificing scale and performance that you get from those sites. So if you just block an entire site to get rid of the bot traffic, you end up blocking all the good traffic too. And this is a key concept in managing fraud, is don't block the good stuff. The second layer is site filtering. So this is removing sites with very high fraud rates where there's so little legitimate traffic that they're just gumming up the works. They may not be bot traffic necessarily, they may be human traffic, but they're misrepresenting or laundering the traffic, which Susan had a really nice illustration of earlier. The third layer is suspicious activity monitoring and prevention. So this layer automatically detects and pre-bid blocks sites that display suspicious characteristics, such as high velocity click-through rates or action rates, high impression to click ratios, among other sort of strange attributes. Malware scans are what we do to ensure that every creative unit on behalf of all our customers is malware free. And this is actually a preventative step that makes sure that we aren't propagating additional bots and fraud into the ecosystem. And then finally, illegal content blocking. So we use industry-leading semantic analysis technology to provide pre-bid blocking to avoid sites that are, for instance, under construction, that are known piracy, or other categories that are highly correlated with site fraud. As I mentioned earlier, our ultimate goal was always to solve this problem for our customers and just take it off the table. So we thought, how better could we do that than to guarantee an outcome? And it was that thinking that led us to create the 97% fraud-free guarantee, which is the only program of its kind in the industry. How it works is that if an advertiser experiences greater than 3% fraud rates in any given month across all their exchange investments, DataXu will refund 100% of the associated technology fees that we charge. And we'll also refund 100% of amounts that we're able to recover from media suppliers. So again, DataXu, for those of you who may not be familiar with us, we operate on the demand side. We don't own and operate any media. And so everything that is purchased through our platform actually is purchased from an upstream supplier. The benefits of this program are that it increases true marketing efficiency. When you reach real people on real sites and you remove the noise from the KPIs that come from fraud, you get fundamentally better marketing results. Our scale is very helpful in enabling us to address fraud in a more efficient and comprehensive manner than customers could really do on their own. And we're able to offer this program at no additional cost. And for those interested, you can view the full terms and conditions of the offer on our website, dataxu.com. So we're really excited about this program. And here we're sharing for the first time some data on how it's going so far. So we're nearly a full quarter into the program, and the results have been consistently strong. Our system-wide rate for the quarter is running under 3%. We've had to issue fewer than 20 credits per month, and this is, we have hundreds of advertisers, so this is a pretty small number of credits that we've had to issue. The credits for the quarter are just under $27,000, and we actually had budgeted $60,000. just another kind of point of color around how seriously we take this, we actually have set up a reserve account in our accounting system with our auditors to cover fraud liabilities that we would incur under this program. So the fact that we're paying out less than we budgeted is great. The CFO loves it. The CEO loves it. We're not ready to take the reserve down because you never know, things could spike up, and when you're managing a program like this, you have to be prepared for the unexpected. So in terms of performance, as you remember, we had a lot of doubts about what would happen if we took out all the fraud from the platform. What would happen to performance? So this was one of the things that we looked at early on when we were preparing to bring this guarantee to market. So we tested 24 campaigns that we monitored without any fraud protection. Then we applied the defense in-depth anti-fraud technologies I described earlier. And we compared the pre versus post metrics and also compared this to a control group so we could be sure to isolate the impacts of our fraud prevention tactics specifically versus just other natural change in the fraud rates. So what we see here, is we're looking at clicks first, and as Susan mentioned, bots are very good at clicking on ads. So it wasn't surprising to us to see that as you remove fraud, your CTR goes down and your CPC goes up. And this isn't to say that your true CPC or your true CTR are getting worse, but the fact is you didn't know what your true CPC or CTR was because of the fraud was creating a false sense of performance. Most of us know that click metrics are not the most meaningful KPIs, and yet still people use them, including many of our customers. And I would just say that the evidence here kind of speaks for itself. Any metric that gets materially worse when you remove fraud is probably not the best metric to focus on because it isn't measuring true marketing outcomes. So we advise our customers not to focus on metrics like CTR and instead try to focus on deeper, more meaningful conversions. But if you do use clicks as a primary performance metric or a secondary one just to kind of have something that's even across all providers, you do need to be prepared to set a new baseline for this metric once you put a robust fraud production system in place. So while removing fraud may take may make some of your metrics look worse, by avoiding wasted spend on ads that are never seen by a real human, you're only going to see improvements in real performance because more of your budget is actually being put to work. So this is an important point, and you can see that demonstrated in what's happened to CPA after filtering out the fraud. So in fact, across these 24 campaigns we tested, we saw that CPAs outperformed by 18% as compared to the system-wide CPA during the same time period. And in the next slide, we have a particularly powerful example, which is a case study of an automotive advertiser. And in this study, we're showing that the auto advertiser benefited during this period of time when we were steadily ratcheting down the fraud, which you saw in that earlier graph. So the metrics here are based on DFA click conversions, and the fraud was measured by integral ad science. In this example, the action here was a form of completion, a form completion. So relatively deep, though not quite as deep as like a full-on e-commerce checkout with a credit card approval. That's a deeper conversion even still. But we viewed at the time that this metric was relatively uninflated by fraud, but the fraud itself was making the campaign inefficient. So while the CPA started at $1,400 without fraud protection, we were able to drive that down to $300 after reducing these fraud rates. So you can see the dotted line here is the fraud rate, which at that particular time, and this was October of 2014, we had gotten it down to around 9%. Of course, we continued, as I showed, to reduce the fraud rates further after this test period down to between 2 and 3%. So wrapping things up, we know fraud is a big thorny problem. It's not something that our industry is very practiced in dealing with, practiced in thinking about and really kind of understanding. I guess, who in marketing went, got into it to fight fraud. I mean, nobody did. I mean, it's different than other industries that have had a longer, more historical problem with fraud. So there aren't a lot of professionals, I would say, in the industry that are really adept at dealing with it. And as we shared today, we had a lot of concerns and doubts ourselves, and I know many others grapple with the same issues in terms of, what it will do to your scale or your performance or your revenue or whatever business metrics you're concerned with. Our hope is that our story will help others realize that they can succeed, if they're committed to addressing the problem. And I think the good news is that we're finding advertisers and partners are, in fact, really ready to listen to what it means to make a meaningful change on this problem. And beyond listening, we're finding that they're really embracing marketing investments. So that's all we had for today. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much to Susan from Fraudster for joining us. And I will hand it back to Shane.
Thanks, Aaron. That was terrific. Susan, thank you so much. Before we get to questions, one bit of marketing. We have another webinar. We're calling this one Deconstructing Ad Fraud, Insights, Impact, and Best Practices for Marketers. This will be co-presented with DoubleVerify, and it will cover some of the same ground we've covered today, but will be, I think, a particular use to folks who are even closer to the media execution side, brand managers, planners, trading platform operators, some real kind of news you can use. We'll be doing this on April 14th and 15th at these two times to accommodate folks across the world, because I know this industry this issue has global impact. One question that's immediately come up is, will this session be recorded? Yes, we are recording the session. We'll be sharing it by email to registrants and attendees sometime early next week. We'll open it up for questions, and by way of reminder, to ask one, please use the questions box located in that GoToWebinar console up and to the right. Click on that red arrow. We've got a first question, and Susan, this question is for you, and it's I guess a question about the industry. How can the industry work together to fight fraud from an advertiser and a buy and a supply side perspective?
Right. Thanks, Shane. I believe the industry should participate in all the IAB-sponsored organizations and working panels, and make your presence known, participate in them, ask the questions, present case studies of your experiences with them. And on an individual level, aside from everyone should just be ethical, obviously, people should be clear about who they're working with, I think, is really the single thing that both publishers and marketers can do. Choose your partners wisely and understand that to get quality, you need to pay for quality, and that quality will give you a better return on your investment than a bottom dollar investment will. Does that answer your question?
Let's hope so. I thought it was terrific. The next question is for Aaron, although Susan, you may have perspective on this, and it's about viewability. The question is, how do stacked ads affect viewability? Is the impression still considered in view?
Nice question. So the viewability standard, they have a little backdoor to the standard, actually, which is it's supposed to exclude fraud, first of all. Now, what they don't go on to say is, like, well, how do you know if it's fraud or not? So according to the standard, it will not be in view. Only the top one would be in view because the other ones are fraud. I would say where the nuance comes in is, okay, the measurement vendor itself, is it counting them inadvertently because it doesn't know they're fraud, or is it successfully filtering them out because they know it's fraud? And I couldn't answer on behalf of all the viewability measurement vendors out there, so that's probably as far as I could take that one. But I think most of the good ones have a fraud system that they have in place, and they should be filtering that stuff out.
That's great. Thank you. Oh,
I can
go
add
ahead,
a little bit to that. There are 16 accredited, MRC accredited viewability vendors. As I mentioned earlier in the beginning of my presentation, some of them are also fraud detectors. Not all are, however. Most of them are only capable and will only claim that they can certify viewability to a 70% level. Only 2 of the accredited vendors approach 100%. Those are Moat and Google's ActiveView, which is embedded in DFP and DFA. I think the thing to do if you are thinking of working with a viewability vendor or more than, and the other thing is that each vendor has its own unique way of measuring, and there is no process right now for reconciling the differences between vendors. So what the IAB suggests is, from a marketer and a publisher point of view, you agree in advance to work with a specified viewability vendor, and both marketers and publishers should determine what level of fraud that their particular chosen viewability vendor is capable of detecting.
That's great, Susan. I'm actually going to give you the opportunity for the final question, if you can do this in a minute or so. The question is, I don't really understand the daisy chain you talked about. Can you explain how a premium publisher can end up with fraud?
Sure. So what happens is that most marketing campaigns require a certain level of scale. Publishers who get the campaign are guaranteeing a certain level of delivery on scale. If they do not have enough traffic of their own organically to meet the guarantees that they have given, and because they certainly don't want to refund or have to do make goods, they go to traffic vendors. It's possible, I'm told, to buy traffic on eBay. There are many sources of traffic. What happens for even the most responsible of publishers, and we're talking publishers in the ComScore top 50, I mean the biggest, most well-known brands out there, will then go to a traffic vendor and buy from that traffic vendor. What they don't do is find out who the traffic vendor is getting the traffic from. And when I refer to a daisy chain, I mean that the traffic vendor may have 3 or 4 sources of traffic themselves, and those sources may have 3 or 4 traffic sources. So it's a geometric multiplication of possibility for bad traffic to be introduced. Was that clear?
That was great, Susan. Thank you. You guys are probably seeing my Susan's agenda slide, actually. Ongoing difficulties with our friend GoTo. Thank you so much for attending, everybody. As noted, you guys should get an email early next week with the recording. Thanks, Susan and Aaron, and for all of you guys who attended.
Thanks so much.